All righty, cool. All right, so obviously we can begin. Welcome everyone again to the debate camp. This is going to be the basic intro lecture. It's not going to be too heavy or specific to kind of the resolution, as JL was kind of mentioning that this year will be about water protections and water resources. It won't be heavy on the content. It'll be more so on the form and exactly like what y'all do in the debates. And kind of informing everyone who isn't aware exactly like how, pretty much tournaments go and all those type of things and like what you will obviously have to do. So like I said, just to give a little bit of context, I've been in the league since high school. I started in the ninth grade at Plymouth Preparatory High School in 2009. And I have pretty much been active in the league in some capacity, whether it be a competitor, judge, or a coach, right? So like B had mentioned, I've been in activity like 13 years now. You will notice that obviously the confidence that I may potentially have are kind of the description of a lot of these things. It doesn't come naturally. I don't want anybody to assume that you have to be just like skilled off of the bat in terms of being a persuasive speaker or somebody that is confident when doing public speaking. It's one of the toughest things to do. Even the best people you can think of struggle sometimes often with being able to express their ideals or views in front of a crowd or a group of people. Cool thing y'all don't have to worry about is it's not like the movie The Great Debaters where you have to be in front of a auditorium of over a few hundred people with like this pre kind of typed up speech and you're in a suit and tie. And there's a panel of like 12 judges. It's not like that. It will only be you and your partner against another team of two and one judge. And that's pretty much for preliminary rounds. That's like always the case. Once we go back in person, obviously this will be in a classroom at like Manugian Hall or something like that, right? But right now, because of the pandemic, obviously y'all will only be in like virtual Zoom rooms, and the only people allowed in the rooms will be ones that are competing or permitted by obviously the staff, be it John Lawson, Sydney, or myself. So just to kind of potentially, shake some nerves, y'all don't have to worry about always competing in front of a large crowd or like everyone here, right? That will only kind of happen potentially in later rounds where people who didn't make it will like watch you in e-lens, those type of things, right? So I guess to kind of start off with what policy debate is, right? I kind of think of it as two sides contesting each other's ideals to find the best option for change. The whole entire point of policy debating is both sides contesting a particular view or a plan or policy or law that should be introduced that resolves like something in the status quo, like some issue that is happening right now, right? And the affirmative's duty, right, is they have to affirm that there is something that we have to do utilizing the United States federal government to be able to resolve that thing, right? And then the negative's job is essentially they have to disprove the affirmative, right? So they have to either argue that whatever the affirmative's plan is insufficient to resolve whatever issue that they've isolated that's happening right now. They can come up with a better option, right? Or it will get to a counter plan, essentially, right? Or a different method or law that they can pass that will be able to sufficiently resolve whatever issues the affirmative has introduced, but better, right? You can have an independent reason why the affirmative will make things worse. Or you can argue that whatever the affirmative is talking about isn't even relevant or central to the discussion of, for example, the resolution, water resources, right? Or water protections in the United States. You won't have to stick with one side through the entire season, right? So every tournament, you'll have multiple chances to debate on both sides of the coin, both to affirm a change in the status quo and to negate the affirmative. You won't necessarily know exactly all the time if you'll be alpha neg before the pairing is released. That will tell you who you're competing against, what side you're on, the judge you have in the room that you're in. But when you're affirmative, you get to pretty much decide what the debate is going to be about, because the affirmative is the one, or at least the team, that introduces their arguments first, right? They set the stage for what the debate is going to be about, right? And both teams get the chance to do both. So obviously you have to do preparation both to create a case that is relevant to the resolution this year. And then you have to also do research to respond to arguments that your opponents or your peers will also introduce as well, right? And normally a tournament, for y'all, it's a little bit different. On average, tournaments last roughly between 2 to 3 days. We have a system to where this year we don't want to put too much strain with y'all being on a computer. So we do have some one-day tournaments that are already fixed into the schedule. But a regular tournament schedule, we normally have like one tournament per month. We will have like 2 rounds on a Friday afternoon and evening, and then we will return Saturday morning to finish the rest of the tournament. So the preliminary rounds, award ceremony, and then elimination rounds until, somebody is crowned a victor and everybody else is eliminated, right? So that's essentially a regular kind of weekend or the process of a debate tournament, right? So like JL kind of mentioned previously, there is a resolution this year. It is on the camp website if you want to quickly access or reference it for a future point. But this is essentially what we will talk about the entire season, their entire year, so that the United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of water resources in the United States, right? So in some way, shape, or form, if you are affirmative, you need to introduce a plan that says that the federal government will do something, right, that will increase protections of water. And that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. I won't really detail too much because y'all will have a specific content lecture that will happen tomorrow. But pretty much if you can think of like anything that is relative to ways in which that we can better preserve fresh water sources, then it's something that will be a relevant discussion, right? So even JL mentioned like the Flint water crisis, the ways in which we potentially like with dams, that can be a potential affirmative. There's a lot of things, right? So as long as it's relative to this resolution, it can be discussed, right? So when you're in a debate, or at least like when you are competing, there's a particular structure that you will follow, or at least like a specific speech format that everybody follows that makes sure that everybody has a fair chance to be able to argue either side and contest the opposing teams. Right. So essentially what y'all see on the screen, like I said, is a speech order for a debate tournament, or just not a tournament, but a round itself. Right. So you can see that there are some acronyms or some little abbreviations, which I will explain. And then y'all can obviously write it down. So whenever you see AC, right, this is okay. Exactly. We will post this afterwards. Right. So AC is affirmative constructive. Right? So whenever you see that in an acronym area, that's what it means. NC is negative constructive. The numbers correspond to the speaker position. So say, for example, Sydney and I are partners, right? And Sydney speaks first on our team. She will be the first affirmative constructive or the 1AC, right? So obviously following suit, if I'm on the same team, that means that I'm on the affirmative side. If I'm the second speaker, then I will be the second affirmative speaker, right? So I would give the second affirmative constructives, the second affirmative rebuttals, etc., right? And then the same thing for the opposing team. Let's say if JL and Doug are on a team, right? And JL would be the first speaker for the negative. Then he would do the first negative constructive or the first negative speech, right? And then Doug would do the second negative constructive or the second negative speech. So if you look at the order, you will see that all constructive speeches last 8 minutes long. So you will have your own timer. The judge will have one as well. I would obviously highly recommend that you have your own timer to keep track of yourself and make sure that you're efficiently getting through reading your evidence or stating your points in a timely fashion. But you have 8 minutes to do your constructive speech, right? So you can pretty much do anything in that speech as long as it is obviously supporting your claims. If you're the first affirmative speaker, you're not going to be doing too much argumentation. Good job, Linda. I will include that as well, right? So you won't be doing much argumentation for the first affirmative speech. There will just be a lot of you reading the evidence that you have found through, for example, if you have a good idea, let's see if you want to do the Flint water crisis and affirmative case on that, then you would do substantive research to find articles that support the government needing to do something or introduce some law or policy, right, to resolve the Flint water crisis or issues that are similar, right? So within those 8 minutes, you would then recite or read the evidence that you have accumulated or pretty much compiled to make the central argument of why it's necessary to do that plan, right? So that's essentially what the first affirmative does. Normally, they don't have to do too much because the negative, obviously, at this point hasn't said anything. The debate just started. They're just setting the stage or just giving kind of the foundation for what is their main argument, why it's good that we need to focus and discuss those issues, and if the plan is a viable option to be able to resolve those kind of harms or those bad things that are happening right now, right? So after each constructive speech, the opposing team has an opportunity to ask the team that just presented questions for 3 minutes. You can ask whatever questions that you want, but you have 3 minutes to do so, right? So obviously maybe there's a piece of evidence that they read that you weren't really clear on, or you're not sure what argument they're making, right? That's kind of prime time for you to kind of ask those questions so you can get clarity from the opposing team. If for example, you want to try to start setting up your arguments, which a lot of times what cross-examination is utilized for, you kind of want to use it to pit them into making kind of definitive responses, right? So you want to make sure that they don't really kind of have any ambiguity behind any of their claims. You want to clearly know exactly like what points are they making, what will they defend, what will they not defend, because that allows you to be able to know exactly like if your strategy will be feasible or a good one to go against the opposing team. As Linda mentioned in the chat, each team has prep time, or at least throughout the debate, before your speech and after. You have the option, or before cross-ex. And when I say after, it like literally has to be like right after your speech is over, before cross-examination begins. You have the option to utilize prep time, or at least you have like some free time to be able to either collect your notes or your thoughts, communicate with your partner, to be able to potentially change strategy, or to, discuss exactly how y'all are going to deploy your arguments, who's going to take what in terms of dividing up responsibility for arguments you need to respond to. You can use prep time however you want, but you have to be mindful when you are utilizing prep time. It's not a one and done thing. So for example, each team gets in high school 8 minutes per team of prep time that you utilize throughout the entire debate. You do not have to use the entire 8 minutes, for example, if you want to like prep before the 1NC or something. You don't have to use all 8 minutes. You can use 30 seconds. You can use 2 minutes and 13 seconds. It does not matter. It is up to you to decide when you want to start and stop prep. But obviously you want to indicate to the judge when you are starting or stopping prep, so that they have kind of the correct timing, or making sure that they're keeping track of how much you have. It's best to save prep time for later in the debates, because that's when you'll be kind of giving the closing speeches, and you want to kind of have time to be able to kind of assess what has happened in the debate, be able to kind of jot down your central kind of main points in terms of why the judge should vote for you and all those things. So you don't really want to use prep time earlier in the debate. And if you we'll get into preparation stuff, or at least your lab leaders will. If you prep for a tournament properly, you won't really have to use prep earlier in the round. You will only have to use it like later on, once there has been kind of more specific argumentation on both sides that you kind of have to like address or kind of resolve, right? So both sides have 8 minutes of prep, right? So like I said, in between each constructive speech, there are 3 minutes of cross-ex. If you look at in between the parentheses, it has the breakdown of who will be cross-exing who. So for example, after the 1AC is over, cross-examination obviously what happened for the 1AC, because they are the ones who have just presented. So the negative team has the opportunity to ask the 1AC whatever they want for 3 minutes. The 2NC, or the second negative speaker, on the negative side, is the one that will cross-examine the 1AC. And the reason why, right, is because if you notice right after cross-examination of the 1AC, the next speech is the first negative speech, or first negative constructive. That will be 8 minutes. The 1NC wants to make sure that they're ready to go, right? That they have all the evidence that they need to read. If they had to kind of tweak or change anything based off of what the 1AC potentially did, they have time to do that, right? The 1NC should not be asking questions, right, against like, or asking the 1AC questions, right? If they're about to speak, right, they should be preparing or making sure that they have everything ready to go. So the 2N, while asking these questions for 3 minutes, is kind of giving the 1NC some free prep time that y'all don't have to take away from y'all official prep time. And then you can just use that for whatever, right? Obviously, if you're ready, you're good to go. You're just waiting until the 3 minutes is over, or when your partner is done asking questions. And then you will proceed to go up to the podium or the stand, and then let the judge know kind of the order in which you will present, and then you'll begin your speech. And then it kind of follows that same order for the rest of the time, right? So after the 1NC, that 8 minutes, they will have a cross-examination period where the opposing team asks them questions. Same thing, the 2AC is the one that gives the speech right after the 1NC, so they should be asking questions. The 1A would take that responsibility. So the 2AC has some time to be able to get things together, right? So again, follow the same order. 2AC speaks, cross-examination of the 2AC by the 1N, because the 2N has to present after that. And then there's cross-examination of the 2NC. Once the constructors are over, there are no more cross-examinations. So obviously, as you mentioned or noticed, the rebuttals don't have any cross-examinations. However, there's a weird thing that kind of occurs in between, in the middle of the debate. So if you've noticed that the affirmative and the negative always kind of trade off, one will present and then the opposing team will present. There's only one time in the debate where 2 teams will kind of have back-to-back speeches. In debate, we call this the block. This is basically the speech time between the second negative constructive, which lasts 8 minutes, and the first negative rebuttal, which is 5 minutes. Essentially, the block altogether, right? 8 + 5 is 13 minutes, right? So that's essentially what we call it. The cool thing about this area in the speech is that the second negative speaker and the first negative speaker can kind of divide up the labor, or they can pretty much split down the middle, right? The arguments that have been introduced, and then they can be able to address them. So, for example, if the affirmative speech or the affirmative constructive, right, or their case, right, has to be contested or argued against. But obviously, the negative will introduce arguments for why they separately should win, right? In terms of dividing that up, the second negative constructive can like only take the negative points or arguments, right? And then the first negative speaker, when the rebuttal comes, can just only handle the case. Now, you have to answer in every other speech. You have to make sure that you respond to every point and that you don't concede or drop anything, as we call it, right? You have to make sure that you respond to it, because in debate, a conceded argument is a dropped argument. If you don't contest it, then it's true. That's like if I say the sky is green, and then the next speech you come up and you don't address it, then that means that the sky is green, regardless if that is a factual statement or not, right? But in the context of debate, you did not contest it, so it is seen as valid, right? For the block, that is not necessarily the case. So just because the 2NC, for instance, isn't arguing claims or arguments that the affirmative has made about the case debate, that does not mean that they have conceded that the affirmative is right about all their points on the case. They have instead just given the responsibility to the first negative speaker on the rebuttal to handle that duty while they handle the negatives arguments, right? So that means that they have more time to spend developing their points or claims while the judge will vote for them, and vice versa, right? So after the first negative rebuttal, right, there's a 5-minute speech. It just pretty much follows off like that. Before every speech, everybody has the opportunity, if permitted, or at least if they still have some, to take prep before their speeches. I think that it's obviously very important that pretty much for all rebuttals, you want to make sure that you take a little bit of prep time so that you aren't kind of forgetting anything, so that you can kind of re-clarify with your partner that you're going to touch on a particular issue that you need to win the debate and all those things, right? So to make sure that you are using prep time wisely. It is a practice that is not going to come naturally. Over time, you will notice how to better utilize that and have better practices between you and your partner. But overall, yeah, that's essentially how it works. So yeah. Cool. So when you are debating, right, both either affirmative or negative, right, offense and defense is a very significant and critical thing that you want to make sure that you are doing on both sides. Like I said, for you to win a debate, you have to have offense, right? Or you have to have a reason for the judge to vote for you, right? And then defense, obviously, right, you want to defend or kind of disprove some of the opposing team's arguments, or kind of mitigate some of the risks, right? Or make it seem like it's not that much of a big deal or not that significant, right? And I mentioned in the PowerPoint, I kind of think of it as like basketball, right? Offense is like scoring, defense is like defending or guarding, right? But the one rule of thumb that is true about basketball, but not true about debate, in most cases, you can't just win off defense, right? So you don't want to just only rely on defensive arguments to win the debate. You want to give an explicit reason why it's very clear, right, to the judge why you won the debate. Just that, plain and simple. You don't want to leave it on the whim of them assessing whether or not impact is a real thing, or if you did enough to argue that it wasn't that big of a deal. You want to give them a separate reason why your issue or deal, whatever, is way more significant than the opposing teams, right? So I guess to kind of clarify, explain the difference again between offense and defense, right? Offense is the reason why the judge should vote for you, right? So this can be a particular harm or issue that you've isolated that, for example, the opposing team might cause to happen. Like, for example, if the affirmative case is like, we need to produce more oil, right? A harm or impact that you can say, or a bad thing that occurs from drilling for more oil, can be like, it wrecks the ecosystem, right? It hurts biodiversity. It speeds up like global warming, right? That leads to like people dying. It leads to species being lost. It leads to us not having resources, right? Offense is obviously reasons why whatever they do is going to make things worse. It's going to make things bad. That's a reason why the judge can vote. Like, I don't want to vote on X because it increases warming, right? That's an example of offense. Or you can make what is called a turn, right? Which is pretty much making the claim that whatever the opposing team has said is bad is actually good, right? And obviously, and the example I give is kind of weird and wacky, but it just kind of happens to debate. Just to kind of reiterate the warming impact, right? It hurts the ecosystem, the environment. right? It melts the ice caps, that type stuff. A turns case example would be if I instead said that global warming is good, right? Because the I guess the planet heating up in certain ecosystems and areas where certain species wouldn't be able to live, they can instead thrive, which can bring back other species from the brink of extinction, or it can bring back different like plants and fauna that probably or flora that didn't exist prior or that were extinct for millions of years, but now they came back because of increased temperatures in certain areas, right? So I can argue that like warming instead can be good for certain ecosystems and environments, right? And obviously that's a debate to be had, right? You're just like, okay, we will assess whether or not the effects of warming is either net worse or net better, right? But essentially, you making the turn makes it to where whatever they think that they're resolving, that they think would be a good thing, is actually bad, right? So if their advantage is like, we solve warming, you're like, no, warming's good, then it means that if they're decreasing warming, then they're not actually doing something good. I know that's real confusing. Obviously, in the real sense, you wouldn't want to argue that global warming is a good thing or a good phenomenon for the world. But in debate, it's about what you can kind of justify and argue to the judge in order to get the ballot, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you inherently believe that, right? But that you are good at persuading the judge that the inverse instead was true, that the turns case argument was instead more preferable than the initial claim of what they said was bad, right? And then for the defense side, obviously, this is kind of disproving or mitigating the risk of an impact scenario. So an example of this would be if they said, for example, global warming, right, obviously leads to extinction, right? There's the point of no return once greenhouse gases get so high up, right? It makes it to where it eats up, it just kills everything, right? Defense will be an example of just being like, okay, warming isn't like that bad. Like it won't lead to extinction. So in a sense, it isn't necessarily always disagreeing that an impact could occur, but that the severity of it is not as serious as the opposing team made it out to be. So you just be like, warming does not lead to extinction. Sure, there may be statistical proof that certain species or animals are suffering or having harsh circumstances because of it. But to say that it will lead to the end of the human species, if you have credible evidence that will argue that it wouldn't, right, then that's a defensive argument, right? So it isn't necessarily a win for you in the sense that you gain the advantage of the warming scenario, but you are instead making it to where it's not that big of an issue or that's something that the judge would really weigh as a critical thing that they would, vote on or put their hat on, essentially, right? Before I move on, I guess if anybody has any questions, I can't really see the chat much. So if y'all want to just like, if y'all want to say anything aloud, that is totally fine. If there was any confusion so far. Okay. I'm gonna take that as everybody is good. Okay. So I know I talked a little bit about evidence. So I wanted to give y'all kind of a reference for a point or an example. Y'all will get the packets pretty much sometime later on today, the evidence that y'all will be kind of using for the rest of the week for the camp and for the novices through the season. But this is just like a random piece of evidence that I found to kind of give an explanation of like what y'all will be reading. So in debates, y'all are obviously not just kind of going up there on your own thoughts and just being like, I think this is a good idea, right? You kind of have to have some type of credible reference to support claims that you're making, right? To be able to prove that it is something significant that we either need to focus on, discuss, or whatever the case is, right? So on the screen, this is essentially a piece of evidence, or we call it a card, right? Because for, I guess, not trying to throw shade, before some of the older people in the group, they literally used to have it on index cards. So that's kind of like where it derives from. Now in the technological age is transition to us just having like Word documents, with a whole bunch of articles that we've researched, right? So essentially the breakdown for any piece of evidence, there are three components to it, right? So there's the tag, citation, and the warrant. The tag is essentially the summary or title of that piece of evidence. It's pretty much a short synopsis of what that piece of evidence is attempting to argue or get at, right? So this piece of evidence is talking about specifically for last year's topic, it was criminal justice reform. One of the prominent or popular apps was about the death penalty, right? So whether or not we should eliminate the death penalty in the United States. President Biden is somebody who openly opposes the idea of the death penalty and thinks it's unjust, that it's immoral, it's illogical, and that we should eliminate or get rid of it. There's not been substantial policies that's been introduced to get rid of it in his administration. But overall, he's not really too fond of the idea of like the death penalty, right? So that's essentially what this piece of evidence is arguing. The tag itself is something that you as a debater will create. And essentially you'll be able to do it once you like read over the article, right? So once I found this article online, and I looked at it and I read it through, then I essentially thought of, maybe a 10 to 12 word sentence that can summarize essentially what this is saying and what argument that is attempting to make for me, which is super important, right? So it's not just like I said, a quick summary. It's also trying to, explain, to actually explain exactly like what is the purpose of this kind of tool that you're trying to utilize, or this piece of evidence, right? So the tag, just a short summary, or essentially the argument you are attempting to make. Underneath, where you can kind of see where it says Surratt 21 or 2021 is a citation, right? So this is obviously you giving credit to the individual that you got the article from. Otherwise, obviously, it will be plagiarism. You can't just I can't just find this article, not include the citation, and just have this underlining and all that stuff, because the presumption would be that I made this piece of evidence, right? Or I am the one that typed it up. I'm not, so I have to give credits, just like when you do a paper and you have to have a reference page. The citation is essentially the reference section, right? So all citations are in debate. To make it quicker, you don't have to like read all this like Austin Surratt, William Nelson Cromwell, professor of jurisprudence and political science, etc., blah, blah, blah. If you were in a debate, you would only be responsible having to read the tag, which is the top sentence or summary that we talked about. And then underneath that, you will only have to say the author's last name and the year that it's published, right? You can say the full date if you want to, but for most pieces of evidence, you only have to just say the year that it was published. And then you can proceed to read the underlined and highlighted portions. But again, the citation should have the author's first and last name, some credentials. You probably want to find something that, in their background in terms of either their work experience or their educational experience that prove that they're relevant, that there's somebody that actually has some expertise in this field to discuss, instead of just being some random person. It was like, if it was Austin Surratt, ice cream truck driver, I don't think that sounds super credible for somebody that's trying to argue why we need to oppose the death penalty or not, right? That's just like somebody with an opinion. Right. But if it's somebody that like is a professor of political science, like I'm pretty sure that he's probably discussed or touched some areas relative to the death penalty, done some research on it, something like that, and done some like qualitative and quantitative research, right? So again, first and last name, some credentials. You want to have the original article title in quotations, right? So the original site, you want to go to it and get that original title. You want to have the full date that it was published. So if you can get the full date, this one's January 21st, 2021, that's fine. If, for example, it's like a scholarly article that's posted, sometimes it may not have the exact date, but just like the month and the year, that's okay. Just some type of date reference, and then the original URL that it came from. So this can, if you got this like a regular article from some news publication, you can just post the URL there like it's in there. If it comes from a book, you need to say like specifically what book, what chapter, what page. If there's a particular section that is kind of isolated in the book, you want to like kind of cite that, those type of things, right? So some type of reference to like where you got it from. And then underneath, obviously, this is the original article, but you can see that there's like some green highlighting, there's some like underlining going on, that type stuff. In debate, like this article obviously is really extensive. There's a lot of content, but it would take forever to read all of this, right? It would just take too much time. So essentially in debate, we underline and highlight the significant portions of the article that specifically kind of get you what the tag is trying to say, right? Or it's just like kind of, condensing the article a lot more. Like, for example, I'm not going to read a ton of it, but it's like some areas in here that may just be giving context to particular death penalty cases, which is good content or information. But it has nothing to do with explaining specifically, or is a reference point for the tag, which is talking about Biden opposing the death penalty. So you will obviously want to probably seek out lines that talk about specifically things that Biden has, that is explicit, that proves that he is not for the death penalty. All right. So that's essentially a piece of evidence. This is, y'all will obviously have this, it's already underlined and highlighted. So y'all don't have to worry too much about doing that yourselves. But once y'all kind of develop in terms of y'all experience and y'all create your own arguments, then you will be responsible for essentially doing all of this. So creating the tag, doing the citation work, and then also going through and underlining and highlighting the important and significant portions of evidence. Is any questions about evidence at this point? All right,
Sorry.
cool. Oh, my bad. My bad. Go ahead.
Are we allowed to use like examples that aren't necessarily true, but are like examples like these things happen to people? Could we make up a person that those things have happened to, even if that's not like an actual person?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that I'm assuming you're just asking like if you want to make an analogy to give an example to explain something. Is that what you're kind of asking about? So you could definitely make analogies 100%. If you want, if that helps you kind of explain or give an example to the judge, that's fine. I would say that for like debates in the future, I don't know if this is kind of your question in terms of like when is it legitimate or okay, like when we have to read evidence or not. I think that if you're just giving it here an example, that's fine. I think that if it's like, say if you're trying to reference a particular historical kind of thing that occurred, right? For example, like if you're trying to reference like 9/11 or something, you don't necessarily need a card that like 9/11 happened, right? Or anything like that. But if you're kind of making a bigger argument that's relative to maybe like something about like why the way we look at 9/11 affects like water protection somehow or something, you probably need a piece of evidence on that, if that makes sense. But if you're just trying to explain something or give an example, you don't like need evidence for like a fictional character or something like that. No.
Okay, thank you.
But I think the rule of thumb is you always, yeah, of course. I think that the it's always safer to have evidence that you can rely on as a reference point as opposed to kind of just making like assertions out of what I'm saying, maybe something you've previously read before that you wanted to use as a model or an example in debate. So I would say you can definitely make your own analogies. You don't have to have like like, okay, Neil deGrasse Tyson had to write about like this weird example or something. Like you don't have to have that. But like I said, if you're making a claim or a point, for example, if you're like warming like causes biodiversity loss, like you can say that, sure. And people obviously, if they've done their own research, they can be like, yeah, that's true, whatever. But you probably want to have evidence that breaks down exactly like how warming uniquely affects biodiversity in a particular ecosystem, or some type of breakdown of that, if that makes sense, right? So I would say it's safer to rely on evidence than trying to make references to maybe something that happened or certain laws or something like that. You want to make sure you just kind of have evidence. And also, I guess while I'm here, novices, for y'all will be confined to core files, or essentially we have like the packet that's going to come out for y'all later today. Y'all will only be responsible for like reading that. Y'all can't like externally go and cut y'all own cards, at least not yet, like early in the season. So if you find an article that may even be relevant to water protections or the affirmative that y'all have, you cannot like use that if it's not already in the evidence packet, right? So y'all can't like go and create your own disadvantages, your own affirmative case, that type of thing. That doesn't kind of normally happen until you get to the junior varsity or varsity level, where they call it the open division, where you can kind of just read whatever you want and you can create your own arguments. But to make it easier for people to kind of get the foundational basis for the activity, you'll just be mainly reading just like core files. Any other questions before I move on to the app stuff?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So when you said in the packet, when you give us the packet, when what do you mean like we cannot like go out? I know what you mean by that, but like so we found like a story about it. It does it like have to be like, so if it's like word in the packet, we could look that up, but if it's like something outside of it, so like what do you mean by that?
So, okay, let me give you an example. Let's say that we had an affirmative case, like I was mentioning about like oil drilling or something like that, right? Let's say the affirmative plan is like, we need to get rid of like oil drilling because that's like bad for the environment or something, right? And say my evidence doesn't say you find like some article about like the Dakota access pipeline, right? Which is obviously, I'm saying, like basically a natural gas pipeline that's in like Dakota, that's supposed to transport like natural gas or whatever, right? Let's say like the affirmative doesn't say anything about the Dakota access pipeline, but it's just generally talking about like oil drilling. Like you can't separately just go like, if you saw an article on that and you was like, oh, that's kind of relevant. Like you can't introduce that piece of evidence into the debate, if that makes sense. Like if it was not already given to you, right? Because we've already done the research for y'all. We've already compiled all the evidence. We've made the affirmative cases. We've made the negative arguments, all those things, and it will be given to you. So that means that any other, like say you find some cool CNN article, but it's not in a packet, you can't read that in debate, right? But for example, you can reference it just being like, okay, the Dakota Access Pipeline is an example of like why oil drilling is bad or something like that, right? You can like you can like state that in a debate, but you can't like as a novice, you can't like read external evidence that you found on that, if that makes sense. Does that kind of clarify it for you?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, so novices can only read pretty much what is given to you by the league and your coaches. And like I said, later on in the season, once people kind of develop more, then we'll give the option and access to like, find cards that are, consistent with the stuff that you already have in the packet. But for right now, y'all more so just be confined to a few arguments so y'all can get the grasp of the activity. Okay. So now shifting into, I guess, the different sides, right? So being affirmative, right, like we kind of mentioned before, is the ability for you to isolate something that's happening right now in the status quo, right? Something that's an inherent or relevant issue, and kind of argue or a plan or a policy that will be sufficient to kind of resolve those things, right? That's the job of the affirmative in a nutshell, right? You have to think of a plan or a policy that resolves something that's happening bad right now or will continue to happen if we don't do anything. Right. So this kind of breakdown that I have right here is essentially the components that are necessary to make up an affirmative advantage or case. And you need all four of these components essentially to do it. Right. So when you have an affirmative case, I guess I'll just like start from the bottom up and then like go towards it. So for a topicality or the plan, it's pretty simple. You have to have like a mandate. You have to have like kind of a one sentence kind of general idea of like what the plan does, like what is the action of the plan. So an example would be like the United States federal government should increase its water protection by putting the US military around like the water dams we already have or something like that. Like that'll be an example, right? So it has to obviously have the actor, right? So it will be the United States federal government in this instance, and then it will have the action, like what is exactly the policy or law that the USFG will introduce, right? What is it that they're going to introduce to kind of resolve the issue, right? So that's essentially what the plan is, right? Just like a one sentence explanation of exactly what do you want the government to do, right? That's it, right? Inherency is the next component. It's essentially the first pieces of evidence that you'll more than likely read when reading an affirmative case, right? And inherency essentially proves the relevance of an issue that is like identified by the AF team in the status quo, right? So when I say relevance, like you can't be talking about something else like, for example, an issue that's not happening right now. Like for example, let's say in like if you read some evidence, it's just like agriculture is like was bad in the 1960s. It's like obviously that's a bad thing. That's that's not good. But that's not like relevant to 2021, right? Or if you read like, okay, like, the obesity was a bad thing in 2003. It's like, well, what about 2029? Has it increased and decreased since then? Has there been any change, right? So inherency is essentially some evidence that you will read that will give context to a particular contingent issue that is happening right now. Lily, you raised your hand.
Yeah, so the difference between harms and inherency. Harms is like why it's bad, and inherency is like why it's bad now and why we have to do something now.
Yeah, so inherency is
Okay.
isolating, specifically the issue that's happening like right now. You know what I'm saying? So for example, like we were talking about the oil drilling example or something with the water dams, you can be like, water dams are at risk of, being attacked, you know what I'm saying, currently by X country in a status quo or something like that, right? So it's kind of giving you context, painting the picture for, okay, what is the status of something right now? Is it in good condition? Is it in bad condition? Right? What is the kind of main issue that they have to resolve with it? Right? So that's essentially inherency. It's like, what is the issue, but is it a relevant one? Right? So the next component is harms, right? So this is essentially the evidence that will give context to what will happen if the trend of the status quo continues, or if there's like nothing that occurs to resolve it. Right. So an example, we're talking about the water dams is like right now they're at risk, right? So that's inherency stuff. It's just like currently we have a problem with our infrastructure to protect our water resources. Right. And then the harm will be if we don't introduce any law or policy, then that puts our freshwater resources, at risk of being either, contaminated or, taken or something like that, right? Right. So this is basically isolating what will happen if we don't do anything, right? Harm is essentially the impact, right? The bad thing that will happen. You can think of it that way. Right. And the last component is pretty simple, solvency, right? This is the evidence that you will read or claims that you will make that will support the plan being a good idea or sufficient enough to resolve the harms in the status quo, right? Or resolve the impacts or the bad things that will happen, right? So for example, doing the plan, right? If we put like military people near dams because they're for some reason at risk of being attacked or broken down or something like that or whatever, right? The solvency component will be evidence that talks about why the plan is sufficient to do this. So why the military personnel being near the dams will make it to where our protection increases, right? That our water resources are safer, right? Pretty simple, right? Those are the components that are necessary. You have to have all of these to make up an advantage, right? To make up an affirmative case, you need these components. One of the funny, cool things for some reason, because y'all are kids and y'all find this funny, that you know, the acronym obviously is a curse word, right? So that's a way that you can remember it every time. Solvency, harms, inherency, topicality. If you follow that acronym, then that will ensure that you always have all things necessary to sufficiently have an argument that the judge can vote on, right? So for example, if you don't have a plan, but you have inherency, harms, and solvency, what do? Right? The plan is the course of action that the government will take to resolve that problem. If you don't have a plan text, you don't have a mandate or a law, right? That will be, you know, put into place, right? Then it means that pretty much all the harms that you've isolated that are happening inherently or in the status quo will continue to be an issue, and that, you know, you aren't able to solve it because you don't have a plan. You don't have a policy to fix it. All right, with inherency, same thing. If you have isolated that there are some harms or some issues, you know, or there's something bad that will happen. For example, if you have an impact for like global warming, right? And you're like warming leads to extinction, right? And the plan can solve or reduce emissions. What if you didn't read any inherency evidence? That means that you don't have any evidence that proves that global warming is a relevant or significant issue right now, right? Because what if the negative just comes up and reads evidence that's like emissions are decreasing, right? And they've read evidence from like a week ago, right? Then now the affirmative is non-inherent, right? It's not a relevant issue, right? Because the negative has read an argument or made a claim that it is not something that is a problem in the status quo, right? That's essentially what it means, right? And pretty simple. If you don't read any harms, you don't have an impact, right? So they're just, if you're just being like, emissions are increasing in the status quo, but you don't have any evidence that talks about why that's bad. Like what happens when, you know, greenhouse gas emissions increase, like what that does to ecosystems, all those things. You don't have an impact, right? You've stated that emissions are increasing, right? But you have to talk about like what is the bad thing that happens, right? Because of that, right? So you need all of these components to be able to win. So that means that if the negative at any point in time wins any of these components, or they out debate you on any of these areas, then you cannot win that advantage. Right.
So this is like a whole case, not a point in a case, right?
Yeah,
The points would
all
make
these
up this
components
case.
together is essentially an advantage. And the reason why I keep saying case and advantage is because an affirmative, like the affirmative can introduce multiple advantages or reasons why they need to do the plan, right? So
Okay.
for example, like we were mentioning, like if the one advantage that we've been kind of talking about is like global warming, right? It's just like the plan is key to resolve issues with warming, decreases emissions somehow or something, right? Another advantage or reason why you could do the plan, for example, it can be like the economy, like somehow the plan increases, you know, the, you know, workforce number. So I mean, it means the economy like increases because we have like more output, more GDP, something like that, right? So it can be more than one reason for the judge to vote for the affirmative, right? You can have multiple advantages. You have more than just one. but each advantage has to have all of these components. It's like the example of when you have an economy advantage, if you have evidence that economic decline is bad, and what happens if the economy declines, people don't have obviously money, they can't buy like food, things like that. It can cause like civil conflicts. It can mean that we're more prone or likely to get into conflicts as a country with others, those type of things, right? And you read solvency evidence, but you don't have any evidence that like the economy sucks right now, right? You don't have that advantage. You have to have all the components. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, thank you.
No, no problem. Cool. Right, so another thing or a tool that the affirmative has that I think is super important, y'all need to remember, is that the affirmative has this thing called fiat, right? Fiat, that's a very important word, right? So fiat, essentially, you can think of as this magical wand that makes it to where the affirmative doesn't have to explain the process between like implementation of the plan. So what I mean by that is when we are in debate, we are hypothetically role playing as if we are members of Congress, right? And that we're trying to pass a bill or some piece of legislation that we on a hill and we're like arguing this out, right? Fiat makes it to where we don't have to argue about the procedures and processes that lead to implementation, but it just happens. We just assume in debate that the plan goes through. So you know how maybe on the news, a lot of times you'll see like there's a particular bill that the Democrats are trying to get through, but the Republicans and the representatives that are Republicans or conservatives will probably oppose the deal, which means that it might not like go through, right? Because it needs a certain amount of votes for it to kind of make it out of the House and the Senate. Then it has to get signed, all those type of things, right? Fiat makes it to where you do not have to talk about any of that process. So you don't have to argue how all of a sudden Mitch McConnell became like the most liberal person in the world, right? Or something like that. You don't have to argue that. It just the plan just happens. That's essentially what fiat is. It's just the theoretical implication that like the plan, like under whatever circumstances period, it just goes through. So you're only arguing about what happens post plan in the debate, essentially, right? The negatives point at least should be that they're arguing like what happens when the plan is introduced, right? So that means that negative arguments about the process or procedure of the plan, for example, like the plan won't pass because it's not popular. If the negative made that argument, the affirmative can make the claim that no, we have fiat. The plan happens. We don't have to argue what congressional member voted for. We don't have to have a piece of evidence that it was, favorable in Congress and that the public supported it or that it was constitutional or not unconstitutional in the, past the Supreme Court. You don't have to argue about any of that. The plan just happens. All right, so that's fiat. So if your opponent is asking questions about like who voted on the plan or anything, you just be like, that doesn't matter, right? The plan happened, right? It's the only question should be oriented towards like, is the introduction of the plan a good or bad idea? And like, what is the kind of theoretical world where that's introduced and what happens? And y'all are debating that out, right? Super important, right? And just like I mentioned already, I said at this point, there can be more than one advantage for an affirmative case. You can have like 2, 3, 4, 5, completely up to you. You also have the option of kicking out of advantages. And what I mean by that is that you don't have to spend like, for example, if you're giving the last constructive speech to 2AR, y'all are AF, you want to win the debate, you don't have to spend, if you got 3 advantages, your entire speech trying to extend or argue all 3 of those points. You can instead kind of collapse down to the point that you think is most significant or the advantage that you think you are winning on the most or persuading the judge on the best or you're ahead on in terms of them not being able to, articulate or discuss it better than you, whatever, right? But you want to choose an advantage to go for it, right? So you can essentially concede a point in order to get rid of it. So for example, if I have like an economy advantage and a global warming advantage, and it's like getting later on in debate, and the opposing team has done a really, really good job of arguing against this global warming advantage, but I think I'm a little bit ahead or I've done a way better job on this economy advantage. In my speech, I can essentially agree with a piece of defense that they have extended or an argument they've made. For example, defense we're mentioning is if I said that warming leads to extinction, right? An example of defense, like we mentioned before, will be them saying that like warming doesn't lead to extinction. If I don't want to go for the warming advantage, I can concede their point and be like, we concede that warming doesn't lead to extinction. We're not going for this argument anymore, right? So you can get rid of it. And now you don't have to waste time argue, like, beating a dead horse, essentially. It's just like arguing why warming will lead to extinction if you feel that they've already done a sufficient job disproving that. You can instead invest your time on the economy advantage and trying to win that, or at least trying to argue why that's the more significant point in the debate, if that makes sense, right? And that's important. That I guess I'll point this out too. When you are kicking out of something, you want to make sure that the negative doesn't, or the opposing team doesn't have something that they can use against you. So for example, you conceding the defense means that they're right, that impact isn't a real thing, which means that they can't later argue, for example, well, no, we want to concede that warming, it doesn't lead to extinction. It does. And then somehow they try to argue how they have access to your like warming impact or something, right? You conceding like, yes, warming will not lead to extinction, it nullifies that completely. But say, for instance, I didn't extend that piece of defense that they had, and I was just like, we're not going for this advantage or something, right? Then that allows them to be able to kind of clean up the mess that I left. Then they can just be like, okay, we concede warming doesn't lead to extinction, and then they can essentially later read a turn in another constructive speech and be like, no, warming is good. And then they can just be like, you dropped this, you didn't answer it, now it's our argument, right? You don't want to kind of make it a mess for yourself. Like, just if you extend a piece of defense against an argument that was made against you, then it will nullify that argument, right? Does that make sense to everyone? I know that's kind of tricky, but it is okay if you do not understand it. Also, if you don't want to ask, make sure you just put an asterisk next to it or something. You can ask your your leaders after this, or your lab leaders. But super important that you begin to think about how to properly get rid of arguments that you don't want and not give pretty much your opposing team like free bonus points, right? So when you're being negative, right, I feel like it's a little bit easier as a novice being negative, because I think it's a little bit easier sometimes to refute things, but I also think that the negative has like a lot of different options essentially to win the debate at their disposal, that it makes it a little bit easier to be negative earlier on than I think it is to defend or be like a really good affirmative team. But essentially, when arguing case, we kind of talked about this a little bit, so I won't spend too much time. When you're a negative and you are contesting the case, you don't have to win that all of the components that they have is like untrue, or like that their evidence is incorrect. You just have to win that one of the components isn't true. So what I mean by that is, like we talked about how the affirmative case always has a solvency advocate. They always have evidence that has harms or impacts or isolates the bad thing that will happen if we don't introduce the plan. And they will have inherency evidence that explains why their impact or whatever is going on is a relevant or significant issue that we need to address. If you, for example, prove that the affirmative isn't able to solve, right, or you make solvency deficits or read evidence that disproves that the affirmative plan is viable enough to solve the impacts, then that's it. You don't have to win that like the impacts don't happen and read like you win the defense and stuff. Like, you still should read defense, but you don't have to like win that point. You don't have to win that it's not inherent. Like, if you outright win that the plan is insufficient to solve, then that's it, right? If you win, right, on the defensive end that we're talking about, that whatever impact that they're talking about is not that severe an issue, it's not that big of a problem, or that they're just essentially wrong about how they've kind of articulated this specific scenario, then that's it, right? You don't have to win the rest of the four, right? So the burden is on the affirmative, that they have to win that all of those components are true and factual, or that they're on the right side of it. But you just have to win that one of those components isn't the case, right? So either that there's a solvency deficit, that their impact isn't that big of an issue, that's not a relevant issue. Like I said, you can deploy offense, and when you make like a impact turn, so you just can say like, no, actually warming is good, right? So if you win that, then it's over, right? You can read what is called alternative causes, right? Which is pretty much arguing that there are other causes or factors that can lead to the impact. For example, with warming, we know there's a multitude of things that leads to kind of global warming or environmental degradation. It's not just burning coal, right? There are ways that, obviously a whole bunch of like the production of like the food industry, those type of things, or kind of bad practices with just like agriculture with like pesticides and all those things. Those are ways that we also affect our environments. It's not just like one singular way. So alternative causes is just a claim saying that there are other ways in which that the impact can happen or that's causing the impact to happen that the affirmative does not discuss or kind of resolve through the plan, right? So these are kind of, pretty much inherent examples of how the negative can deploy some good arguments against the affirmative and like beat them out. Is there any of these that are confusing to y'all or that y'all needed to kind of reiterate? All right, cool. All right. So, like I said, as a negative, you aren't only the entire time just going to be refuting the negatives, the affirmative's case, right? You want to separately introduce arguments that the judge can vote on independently as reasons why you should win the debate, right? It's not just going to only be like the case debate the entire time. And one of the options, or as we call them, off case positions, right, that you can introduce as a negative debater is topicality. Right, topicality. So what topicality, or T for short, right, is the negative's way of being able to say that whatever the affirmative is discussing or whatever the plan is about is not relevant to the discussion of the resolution, right? It's not on topic, right? As y'all notice, there are specific and very particular words and phrases that were utilized in the resolution when it was written, right? And obviously the way in which we interpret those words determine how we will kind of engage the topic. It will inform like how we research about the topic. It will inform like what is your preference in terms of like what you want to say in the debates, all those type of things, right? The only central thing that both sides have that never really changes essentially before any debate is a resolution, right? That is kind of the starting point for everybody when it comes to, this discussion and research, right? So the negative as being the team that has to refute the affirmative or respond to the affirmative means that you're kind of always reactionary, right? The affirmative is the one that sets the stage for what that debate is going to be about. Always. They always start off the debate. So whatever the plan is or whatever the app is, that is literally centering what the debate is mainly going to be about. That is what the affirmative thought was the most significant thing to discuss, right? So again, if the negative can only kind of respond to that, then that means that you have to have some level of prediction to be able to assume what could the affirmative say potentially when looking at the resolution, right? So when you look at it, obviously you already know the United States federal government is included. So you can safely assume that they won't use any other external actor, right? They won't use like like Russia, or they won't use some private organization like Tesla or something like that or whatever, right? It's just they will use the United States federal government. Under no circumstance will they use anybody else, because that's obviously what the resolution entails. And it says that it will increase its water protections, or essentially it will increase protections of water resources, those type of things, or have increased water protection, right, in the United States. So that would be something that's either essentially owned by the United States or that's within U.S. territory, right? So you don't have to worry about like a discussion about like water resources in the South China Sea or something like that, right? It will only be about U.S. federal government water resources in its water protection kind of systems and infrastructure, right? That is what the negative will assume. So this will inform your research and make you think about exactly, or at least have an idea about exactly what the affirmative could say, right? But what if the affirmative just doesn't talk about those things? What if they just completely just jettison the discussion about water protections and start talking about, I don't know, the Pistons gonna win a championship this year? They're not. I feel hopeful, but right. Let's say they just made this argument. It's just like the United States federal government needs to pull in like $6 billion to the Detroit Pistons basketball organization so they can win a ring, right? It's good for the economy because of viewership or something like that, right? It's good for health because people see, you playing basketball and other people want to imitate it. So it means that the government's, or the country's health will go up or something like that, right? Why in the world would the negative ever be able to assume this is the case? Like, there's no way possible that I will be able to think that the affirmative, the 1AC, is going to begin with a discussion about the government giving money to the Detroit Pistons. No way possible, right? Well, what is your defense against that? Like, what is your way to be able to stop the affirmative from doing so? Topicality, right? This is essentially what the argument is for, is to be able to ensure that the affirmative is staying on topic, right? So just like any argument in debate, there are components that make up, or at least that, yeah, essentially make up this central argument, right? So topicality has four, right? So the first is the interpretation, right? This will be a piece of evidence that you will read that will give a specific definition of a word or phrase, right? So it will probably be like from some dictionary or something like that, or from, somebody that's in a particular field. For example, if you were defining water protections, right? So if you found an article from somebody who like works in the field of like water protections or for like dams or like something like that, something with like water infrastructure, and they gave a definitive definition of like what water protections is, right? Then that will suffice as a piece of like evidence. But specifically, or essentially, it is a piece of evidence that will define a specific word or phrase, right? The violation, right, is how the affirmative's use of the word or phrase is incorrect, or how they have misinterpreted a specific word or phrase that kind of gives them, some ups or, an unfair advantage, right? Pretty simple. So like I said, if they, for example, used like when they said the United States federal government or something like that, it's just like, okay, the National Basketball Association. It's just like, that's not the U.S. federal government. You get what I'm saying? Like, why would you assume that was the U.S. federal government? It's not, right? Right. And then standards, right? So the third component for standards, this is why your definition is better for future and current debates. So this is going to be your explanation or kind of points as to why, right, your definition, it probably will make it to where it will bolster kind of better debates in the future and stuff, right? So some examples of that, right, would be like, for example, limits is a standards argument that is normally introduced when people read topicality, right? So for example, limits is the argument that if we can reduce the scope, or, the ability for the affirmative to kind of just make a litany of arguments that the negative can't predict, right? Obviously that's unfair. Like the negative should have some level of clarity to be able to assume what the affirmative is going to do, right? So limits in debate is obviously good, or the definition that you've read that gives a limit on a specific interpretation of a word or phrase is good, right? Because it means that y'all kind of have a more clear, concise idea on both sides, what can be discussed and what cannot be discussed, right? And obviously that kind of bolsters better debates, right? You want to have what is called clash in debates, right? You want to be able to actually have some comparing and contrasting of ideals. You don't want to just be talking past each other. For example, if they brought in an affirmative that's talking about like basketball and stuff, but I've prepared stuff with water protections, anything I read is not going to be responsive to the affirmative team. It's going to just go straight past, right? And then they just auto win because they've introduced the argument. I haven't said anything against it. It's just like, yeah, I guess we should give billions to the Pistons, right? Obviously, that doesn't make sense, right? They should be discussing, or at least should be grounded in the resolution or discussion of water protections, right? The negative would not be able to debate otherwise, right? So setting a limit, right, on certain words and definitions, right, or having a more definitive understanding of what those words mean and not as much ambiguity, means it limits the affirmative's ability to create a whole bunch of random affirmative cases that the negative can't predict, right? That's an example of an argument for standards, like limits, right? Predictability, clash, right? Ground is another one that is used, right? Making sure that both teams or both sides, both affirmative and negative, have an equal and fair shot at winning the debate, right? Obviously, that goes into the affirmative's favor if they have an unfair articulation or understanding of, the action that the resolution says, right? So it's important that we hold them to a standard, or at least we hold them to a specific definition, so we have better debates in the future, right? And then the last component is voting issues or voters, right? So this is why the judge should vote for you, right? And why your definition should be preferred, right? And also obviously why what happens when the affirmative doesn't meet your definition, like what bad happens not only in this round, but in future debates, if we allow them to have the kind of gross interpretation of whatever it is they use to justify their affirmative case, right? So this will be an example of a voting issue can be like education, right? For example, if the affirmative is able to read cases that the negative can't predict, and then there's no debate because there's no clash, right? Then that means that you don't learn anything in a debate, right? When people are talking past each other, right, you don't learn anything, right? There's just assertions of claims, but there is no kind of, in-depth discussion of like why those things kind of work well together or not, right? Why one thing is favorable over the other. That doesn't happen in a world where there is no clash, where there is no debate, right? In a world where the affirmative gets to unfairly utilize a word or definition from the resolution, right, and reinterpret it to justify an affirmative that obviously isn't relevant to the discussion, that's not good for education, right? We don't learn anything from that, right? Fairness is another example of a voting issue, right? Did you make the debate more or less fair, right, based off of y'all's interpretation, right? So obviously the debate is unfair if the app can just like read any affirmative that doesn't have to do anything with the resolution, right? It just, I mean, like if they can do that, the affirmative would literally think of the farthest thing from the resolution every time, and it will always have a one up, right? And T prevents that from occurring. Right, that is the significance of topicality, right? Ensuring that the affirmative stays on topic, right? That they are topical. Right. And then I'll just run through it kind of quickly and briefly. So for the affirmative hat, right, obviously you will want to argue against this, right? You don't want to just lose to like, oh, the definition or the way in which you interpreted this word is bad, so you should lose. What if the affirmative or negative's interpretation of a certain word or phrase is bad? Right? What if the way in which they understand water protections excludes certain discussions that are significant to the topic? Right? What if the way in which they determine or define its, right, means that it has to be in possession of the United States, within its territory, but not owned by it, but not in its territory, right? Right, there's a lot of ambiguity behind the way in which we determine or understand words in certain contexts, right? It matters. Substantial means something incredibly different, right? When used in the context of like a substantial amount of money versus a substantial amount of, I don't know, plates or something like that, right? You look at substantial completely differently because it depends on context. It has the same way topicality is debated, right? It is kind of a comparing and contrasting of what is the way in which we should look at the definition of this word in this particular situation, right? So the affirmative, obviously, you should be refuting this. So the like topicality is something that's read in the 1NC, right? After, obviously the 1AC goes, the 1NC would read topicality in that speech. The 2AC, which is the next speech that the affirmative has to be able to refute the negative's claims. In the 2AC, you will probably want to read what is called a counter definition or a counter interpretation, right? So this will be like the affirmative's way of explaining, or at least they will find an article or a definition from a dictionary or something like that to kind of give their own definition or interpretation of a certain word or phrase. All right. So you want to instead argue as the affirmative, like, no, we had a very good understanding or interpreted this word or phrase well, and we think that, right, the affirmative is consistent with that, then you would just literally follow suit. You would give a counter interpretation, or you give a reason why you think your interpretation is better, or at least read a better interpretation that you think is better, right? Next, you would want to make what is called a we meet argument, right? So we meet argument. This is a claim essentially arguing why whatever definition the 1NC has read, right, the affirmative is complying with that definition. Right, so that would just you be giving like a 2 or 3, sentence kind of statement on like how whatever the affirmative does or what the plain text says, whether it's like functionally in the sense of like what it does or textually the way it is written, right? You would just be like, no, we adhere to your definition, like this proves it, right? And then you want to follow literally the same process that you would for example, the standards and voters for your definition. You will also want to do the same thing. Obviously, you don't have to make like a counter violation. It doesn't make sense. Like the negative didn't read an affirmative case. So you want to make a counter violation argument, but you still want to contest how obviously you don't violate, which would coincide with the we meet argument. But you would want to give counter standards and voters though, right? You would want to give reasons why your interpretation or your definition of a certain word or phrase should be preferred, right? And then obviously throughout the debate, there will be comparing and contrasting the definitions in terms of which one is more viable for debates in the future, which one will probably promote better clash, which will have better, a better realm of predictability for the negative, right? Which one is a good limiter for the affirmative, but still makes it to where they have creativity or, at least enough room to kind of make some non-predictable arguments, which kind of gives them a fair chance, right? All right, so you want to do all those things in conjunction with reading a counter interpretation, right, as the affirmative. All right, that's what you have to do. Any questions before I move on? Okay. I know I'm running a little bit short, so I'm gonna try to get through this a little bit faster. Not too fast, but okay. So moving on to disadvantages. This is another negative position or off case position that the negative can introduce against the 1AC or an affirmative case, right? Essentially a disadvantage, right? Or a DA for short, right? Is the reason why the as plan will cause something even worse to happen post implementation, right? So once the plan is introduced or is put into play, as it got signed off, it's a go, it happens, right? Fiat, boom, right? The disadvantage will argue why whatever the plan is doing will externally cause something separate to happen as bad, right? And of course, just like any other argument in debate, it has multiple components to it, and a disadvantage has four, right? So for a disadvantage, the uniqueness is, or at least for the first component is uniqueness, right? So, and y'all will notice some correlation between like the affirmative side in terms of advantages and disadvantages, right? Uniqueness is going to be evidence describing the status of something right now, right? So this is going to be just like kind of on the affirmative hat when you read inherency that gives context to a particular or contingent like issue that is happening right now. Uniqueness kind of serves the same thing for the negative, right? In a similar way, right? This is going to be evidence that kind of would explain, like I said, the status of something or like, the way in which something is happening in status quo. An example I'll give is like the economy advantage is a really easy one. So uniqueness, in an example, if I was reading an argument about the economy, the uniqueness evidence will give context to how is the economy doing, right? Is it healthy right now? Is it stable? Is it very fragile? Is it in the process of like going up? Are we in debt? Like what is going on with the economy? Uniqueness question kind of answers that, right? So an example of like a uniqueness card for the economy advantage will be like, the economy is stable now, but it's in a very fragile state, right? The pandemic made it to where a lot of businesses had to close. People quarantining means that there are a lot of, there wasn't a lot of people at like work. They had to shift a lot of different like business practices, all those things, lost a lot of money from like shipping things overseas because of restrictions of the pandemic. We lost money, those type of things, right? So it's just like the economy isn't completely gone, but it's in a weird limbo, right? So it's just like, it's all right, but it can be doing better, but it's not in the worst condition that it can be in, right? So the uniqueness is just giving context to a particular kind of issue or scenario or situation currently right now, right? Second component is the link. This is going to be like the relationship between the plan and the change, the negative change in the status quo, right? So it is going to, the link essentially explains like, what about the plan has anything to do with, kind of the uniqueness statement you made? Like, what about the plan changes to status of something that you have isolated right now? We're talking about the economy advantage. Our uniqueness argument was that the economy is stable right now, but it's in a very fragile state, meaning that like any big expenditures can mean that it can go in a very negative, way. But any big kind of major kind of benefits to the economy means that like it can trend upward in a very positive fashion. So either way, it can be very volatile, but it's in a stable condition right now. Link argument can just be like, the plan costs billions of dollars, right? So obviously that is the negative change in the status quo that the plan causes, right? So obviously for water protections, it probably costs money for, whatever, whether it's upholding infrastructure, whether it's paying people to survey or protect certain areas, properly treating and keeping like, different like bad stuff out of the water, contaminants, all that, like all that costs money, right? So you can just be like, new water protection policies are heavy expenditure, right? We have to deficit spend, or it costs like billions of dollars or something, right? That is the link, right? That it's showing that there's a relationship between what the plan does and a negative trend, from the uniqueness question, or what's happening in the status quo, right? The next component is the internal link, right? So the internal link pretty much explains the kind of the story between the negative kind of change that the plan creates and the harm or the bad thing that will happen because of it, right? So an example of the internal link argument is like the plan costing a whole bunch of money means that the economy collapses, right? We obviously we're already trillions of dollars in debt, and we have to spend even more, like billions and trillions of dollars for the new plan or policy, right? So the plan makes the economy collapse because it was already fragile. The plan costs billions of dollars, whatever. Right. And then the last component, oh yeah, Lily, yes.
So like expenses and I guess byproducts aren't covered by fiat, right?
No, well, essentially, like say for instance, I think you always have to, especially on this topic, I feel like questions about the economy or spending will be a significant thing or issue. So I think that it's important for you to kind of know how much the plan costs for sure. The fiat doesn't resolve kind of like, oh, we don't have to worry about how much we spend on it. Because post plan, there is money spent. You don't necessarily have to argue like, okay, there was like they argued about how much money they're going to allocate or whatever. Like if the opposing team, for example, in cross asks like how much the plan costs, you probably should know. But even if you don't, I don't think that means that like it doesn't cost anything. You know what I'm saying? I don't think fiat resolve it. You're just like, yeah. Okay. Like the plan happens, it costs money. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I think fiat, like I guess to clarify, fiat more so resolves kind of the political implications of implementation. I guess you can like take it that way, right? So like I was saying, it doesn't kind of you don't have to argue the like certain congressional members in terms of how they like view a certain policy ideologically or like something like that, right? Because that was the case, we would never get anywhere. That's like even over the past few years where, for example, on the criminal justice reform topic, arguing anything that like Trump would pass in terms of him, like, really progressive policies. Like we would have to argue that like all of a sudden Trump just has this change of heart and for some reason cares about the social well-being of the world. Like you would have to do that in a world of like fiat, in a world without fiat, right? But like, you don't have to do that, right? That's essentially what that's for. But questions about like spending, those type of things are warrants that the affirmative does have to respond to. That's a really good question though, in terms of like what fiat lets you get away with and whatnot. That's a really good question. So like I said, to reiterate, internally, it describes kind of the relationship between the negative change in the status quo and the harm or the bad thing that will happen. The internal link in this context will be economic decline, obviously, because the plan costs a lot of money. We've already isolated with the uniqueness question that the economy is in a fragile state right now, and big expenditures would negatively affect it. And then obviously the fourth component is the impact, which is the negative or undesirable change in the status quo, right? So this is essentially where you would have some evidence that talks about what happens when the economy declines, right? So obviously you just be like, okay, recession happens, means that people can't like afford housing, means that like very key resources or things that people rely on, they may not be able to get access to, like health, like clean food and water, stuff like that. It can cause like resource conflicts with other countries. A lot of times economies that aren't doing well are likely to promote like fascism, or tyrannical regimes. So that can mean that like the government can become like really messed up, right? So just a litany of different impacts that can be read. But essentially that's what the impact is for. Like that's the negative or undesirable change that happens because of the plan. Right, and that's essentially the component, the four components of a disadvantage. Right, and just like we were talking about, to kind of quickly go over it, as an affirmative, when you're responding to a disadvantage, right, you want to utilize both offense and defense to respond to those things. And the same thing, like I was explaining with the affirmative, how you have to win all of the components for an advantage to win that. Like you have to win the inherency debate, you have to win the harms debate, you have to win the solvency debate, and then extend your plan in every speech. The same thing is true for the negative when they read disadvantages. If they don't win all four components, they do not fully have a cohesive disadvantage that the judge can vote on. If the disad, for example, is non-unique, then the judge can't vote on it. For example, if like you read evidence that the plan is expensive and that economic decline is bad and it leads to war and stuff, like obviously that's fine. But if you don't read any evidence that says that, hey, like right now our economy is good. If the AF comes up and reads a card that's like US economy is doing great, right? Then that disproves the uniqueness question of the disad. It's no longer relevant, or it's not contextual to what's happening now or the status of the economy right now, right? Same thing with the link. If you're like, the economy is unstable, and then you don't have a link argument that explains why the plan specifically or some policy for water protections is expensive, but then you just have evidence that says that economic decline leads to war or economic decline is bad, then there's no link to the affirmative. There's no relationship between what the plan does and creating a negative trend in the status quo, right? So, and that follows suit for the rest of them. You have to win all four components as the negative to win the disadvantage, right? And like I said, in terms of utilizing offense, when like if the affirmative made an argument where you're saying economic decline is bad because it leads to war, if they're making arguments that's like, for example, impact term would be economic decline is good, right? Economic decline means that the U.S. economy, it goes to, it's crappy or trash, and that means that like we can't fund military operations abroad that kills people, or we can't continue to promote systems of. All right, just to reiterate really quickly, right? This was the stuff we went over for counter plans, right? It's the negatives way to be able to resolve or solve the affirmative cases, harms or impacts, right? We talked about that it needs three components. It needs a counter plan text, just like the plan, or the affirmative case needs a text. It needs a solvency advocate or evidence, right? To talk about how the counter plan is sufficient to solve the harms, if not better. And third, you need a net benefit or an advantage, right? Or a bonus or an external reason why you will vote for the counter plan over the affirmative case, right? Or the affirmatives plan, right? Super simple. Boom. All right. So in terms of answering counter plans, this is an acronym that is going to save your life all of the time. It's very easy to remember, right? And if you follow this order, you will always have a sufficient response to a counter plan. The acronym is called SPOT, right? Some people say stop. Some people say, TOPS, it doesn't matter, right? As long as you use this acronym, you will be fine, right? And the four letters, obviously I'll go over. The first for the S is solvency deficit. This means that you need to make an argument in terms of why the counter plan doesn't solve as good as the affirmative plan. Really simple, right? Second is a permutation. Now this one is a little bit difficult, right? So permutations is one of the arguments that you can introduce into a debate that's called a theory argument. Theory arguments are arguments that debaters use to argue like what practices or what kind of things are good or bad for the activity. So not necessarily a certain argument that somebody's read, like a disadvantage or something, but it's literally about like the way in which they presented it, or, something like that. It's not about necessarily the evidence. It's literally a personal kind of subjective injection about what do you think is a good or bad practice that will promote good debates and promote better education, right? So a permutation is an argument that the affirmative gets to make against the counterplan, right? So when you're in the negative world, you don't have to be topical or on topic. So what I mean by that is you have a counterplan and you want to solve the affirmative's advantage or harms. You don't have to have a plan that the United States federal government does, or at least it doesn't have to be grounded in the resolution. As long as the counterplan solves the affirmative stuff, it doesn't matter. Like if the affirmative has an advantage that somehow they solve the economy through something they do with water protections or, water resources, cool. But if you came up with a counter plan that's talking about, well, right, we were talking about yesterday, the analogy of like the government should just give a whole bunch of money to the Pistons. And that's like they won a championship. It's going to increase viewership. It's going to be a whole bunch of money for the economy. That doesn't have anything to do with water resources. But if the negative can prove that that is a better way to boost the economy, then you can win that argument, right? Permutations ensure that the counterplan, or at least the negative, is being original when they make the counterplan. They're ensuring that they're not just stealing what the affirmative is doing and then just putting like a little disguise over it to make it seem like it's its own thing, right? That's what a permutation is for. I like to think of it as like a Venn diagram, right? So like on one side, you have the affirmatives plan, and on the other side, you have the negative counter plan, right? And then when you combine them together, which is what a permutation does, because it advocates to do both of them or some combination or variation of both of them like at the same time. So do the plan and the counter plan. You can see the similarities and the contrast between both when you do that, right? Just like a Venn diagram where you see what do they have in common, what's different or unique and separate about those two different worlds, right? So that's the same thing you would do with a permutation. And if you find that, for example, say, when you do the plan of like the government does something water protections and the government gives money to the Pistons, you notice that, hey, the government is involved in both of these plans, right? The federal government does something in terms of giving some money or some resources to some institution inside of the US to make some money or something, right? So you see that that's the similarity. Obviously, the contrast is the affirmative plan does something with water resources, the negative does something about basketball, right? So obviously, with the differences, you would see that there are some nuance, but it gets to the same result, right? It's solving the economy. But you doing the permutation means that you can kind of steal the bonus that the negative kind of has in the process of the permutation, right? Because you're saying you want to do both. You want to do the plan for water resources or whatever, and you want to do like the little Pistons plan or something, right? So that's essentially what a permutation is. It checks to make sure that the negative is actually being original, right? Y'all will work on this more a little bit in y'all's labs, I would assume, but that's essentially what a permutation is. It tests the competitiveness or the mutual exclusivity, right, of a counter plan. Third component, offense. We talked about this yesterday, the difference between offense and defense, right? So offense in the context of the counterplan will be a reason why potentially the counterplan would trigger a new impact to occur, right? Why potentially could, even link to their own impacts, like if they, for some reason, cause the economy to go bad because it's a bad investment, putting money in the Pistons, we know this, but, right, that's an example, right? You can say like you cause a decline in the economy because you just drop money in the bucket that's not going to go anywhere or something, right? So a reason why it would make things worse or cause something bad to happen, a new harm or even a harm that they try to solve that they cause, right? And in theory, we kind of talked about a little bit, this is kind of a personal injection of what do you think is good or fair for the debate? Are they doing something that is unfair and gives an uneven advantage to the negative side? And it makes it to where it's hard for the app to win, right? So that's essentially a theory argument. Going to go over this real quick. We already talked about permutations a little bit. It tests the competitiveness of the counter plan, right? Again, think of it like a Venn diagram so you can find the comparisons and the contrast between both sides. And further into theory, right? So when people are reading arguments, when you're the affirmative, you have to stick with the plan the entire time. You can't like be shaky about it. Like the 1AC, you read the F and then the negative has like really good arguments in the 1 and the C. You can't come up in the 2AC and just like jettison the whole affirmative. It's like, nah, you're right. That was a good idea. You have to defend it no matter what in every speech. The negative has the luxury of not having to do so. They can pretty much, if they think that they're not doing really good on the counterplan debate and the affirmative is just smoking them on it, say if the 2 and C or the 1 and R comes up and they want to get rid of it, that is their choice, right? However, because they have that unfair choice, that means that the affirmative is always going to have to invest time into responding to the counterplan because the negative ready. You can't just like not respond to it because you think they're not going to go for it later. You have to respond to it until they decide that they don't want that to be a viable option in their strategy, right? But in the cross-sex, after the 1 and C reach the counterplan, you can ask them what is the status of that counterplan, right? So it's you being able to just like ask them definitively, are you going to stick with this plan the entire time and advocate for it? Or at some point, are you just going to decide that it's not something you want to do at whatever time, whatever? But you asking what is the status of a counter plan forces the affirmative to have to tell you whether or not they're going to stick with it the entire time, or if they have the option to kick out of it whenever they want, right? And essentially these 3 statuses explain that. Unconditionality is the world where the counter plan will be in every speech under every circumstance, no matter what. Like every speech you will hear something about the counter plan and the negative will advocate for that counter plan. It's called unconditionality. So if the affirmative after the 1 and C is over is like, what's the status of the counter plan? They say unconditional. Then you can be safe to assume that they're always going to talk about the counter plan. It's always going to be a theme of the strategy in that debate, right? If they say it's conditional, right? Conditionality means that under any circumstance, any means, if they want to concede the counterplan, even if they're winning on it, you haven't made any arguments, if you made really good arguments, they can concede the counterplan. They can kick out of it. They don't have to go for it, right? Simple. Dispositionality is a tricky one. It has changed over time in terms of how people interpret what dispositionality is. Essentially, it's a counterplan or negative that's unconditional, unless the affirmative makes conditional arguments against the counterplan. Some people say it's when you only make offensive arguments against the counterplan. Y'all don't really have to worry about this third one because nobody really runs like, or it says that the status of the counterplan is dispositional. They often will only either say unconditional or conditional, right? So it's really simple. All right, so I will skip that. We'll talk about that later on this week. And then real quick, types of counterplans, right? There are a whole bunch of different types we kind of mentioned or talked about, right? So y'all, for example, will have or already have an advantage counterplan in y'all's files, right? So an advantage counterplan is literally just a counterplan that resolves a specific advantage of the affirmative. like I mentioned before, an affirmative can have multiple advantages. It can have 2, it can have 3, it can have 5. As long as you can read it in 8 minutes, that's as many as you have, right? But an advantage counterplan is one that only serves to solve a particular advantage scenario, right? Agent counterplans essentially is just the plan, but with a different agent, pretty simple, right? So it's as if, say, if Russia or China did the plan, the exact same thing, like same mandate, same process of whatever the affirmative does, but they just change the agent, the person or the actor that will initiate the plan, right? Consult counterplans is when you consult, a specific institution, government entity, or whatever prior to doing the plan. For example, a prominent one that y'all may notice or that may happen this year is like, for example, consult indigenous people or native reservations or something, right? Because for water protection and resources, it has a lot to do with just like, the process of, land in kind of the conflict in terms of like state sanctioned, laws that determine lands as being, ownership of certain people or not, right? So consult counterplans can be good to ensure that parties that would be affected would be in favor of the plan, as opposed to you immediately just doing the plan without any consideration of other parties, right? Plan inclusive counterplans, or PICS for short, right, is a counterplan that does some or almost all parts of the plan or some combination or variation of parts of the affirmative plan. A lot of times this is just essentially where the negative will or affirmative will just say that like the plan is good, but they'll problematize maybe a particular portion or section of the affirmative plan that they think is bad or will have a negative consequence. And then they'll omit that portion that they think will be bad to gain offense or an external reason why you would vote for the counterplan over the plan. But essentially it's a plan and minus maybe some exclusion of something that they find a problem with, right? Process counterplans. This is just a counterplan that has pretty much the same outcome, or at least attempts to achieve the same outcome, but just has a different method or process to get to that, right? So this can be, for example, having water protections, but instead it may go through a method that the private sector utilizes instead of the federal government, something of that nature, right? But process counterplans essentially is literally about how do we get to it explains the middle process, right? What do we do to get to the end result, right? That's what a process counterplan essentially resolves. Time ordered counterplans, in the name, right? It's just a question of how you sequence the counterplan or the plan or the sections or planks of both, right? To be able to achieve something. So it can be like, do the counterplan first and then the plan, right? Or something like that, right? Or we'll delay it 6 months and then we'll have like a meeting. And then when the 6 months is up, we'll do the plan, something like that, right? That's essentially what time order counterplan is. All righty. So we get to the last bit of it, shifting to the critique stuff, right? I know that it was a lot of people that was interested when they did their surveys about critiques. So, here it is, right? So a critique, essentially what I think is an argument that challenges views, mindsets, motivations, assumptions, or intent of the affirmative plan, right? There's always mostly a philosophical focus, right, on the affirmative, right? So it doesn't necessarily focus on exactly like, for instance, the outcome. We talk about like how the negative normally argues action after implementation. Once the plan is implemented, we talk about like what are the good and bad kind of pros and cons of those things. Critiques kind of go beyond that, and it instead seeks to look for a few things. One, it can look for your intention, like why you are motivated to do that in terms of why your thought process motivated you to do it, why you chose a specific method or institution or actor, how you explained or interpreted, or how you, just pretty much how you explain or express your view of a certain group of people or individuals, right? Critiques tend to just like question or essentially, like it says, critique, right? The assumptions of the affirmative. Just like any negative argument or any argument in debate, it has components, it has 3. It's similar to a dissad, but a little bit different because it doesn't have weakness. I like to think of critiques as a combination between counterplans and dissads because it has a link and an impact, just like a disadvantage. And the alternative kind of serves as like the counterplan or the solvency advocate for the harms or the link and the impact, right? So obviously speeding ahead, link, it identifies what about the app is problematic. And like I said, it can be about logic, mindset, a practice, a method, the way to explain a particular group or individual. And why that's bad. The impact, obviously the harm, like the issue that occurs when the affirmative promotes or perpetuates a particular kind of mindset, philosophy, practice, etc. And then the alternative as kind of an introduction, or right, kind of the option for the negative to be able to resolve or solve those things. So this can be changing the mindset, or pretty much adopting a new mindset, a different practice, divorcing certain practices that we found to be bad or negative or harmful, right? So that's essentially what the alternative is the solvency advocate for the critique, right? How do we resolve kind of the ills of the affirmative, or the way that we think or look at things, right? So like I said, it will always focus on these kind of three core areas. There can be kind of a combination of some of these, or the critique can focus on all three, but it will always have kind of a central focus on one of these three components, right? One is epistemology. You could think of it as a theory of knowledge, right? So this is kind of like I was saying, how people understand the world, how they are motivated, you know what I'm saying? The mental sense of like, what they have learned and understood, and like how they engage things. What is their intention? Like, what is their drive in terms of those things, right? Epistemology seeks to understand like what was your basis of knowledge and research to get to the point that you got to, and why we think that's bad, right? Or at least the critique will challenge why they think that's bad. Methodology is about a particular practice or method utilized to do something. So this is literally, it can be a certain method can be using the government, right? Using grassroots organizations. It can be anything, right? But the methodology, or at least a critique of methodology, will always question the method or practice that you utilize, right? And ontology is the study of being, right? How we understand how certain things have autonomy or do not have autonomy, just like how humans or living beings have autonomy, but you may interpret or presume that, like, for example, a rock may not, but then again, it can, right? So that is pretty much the study of ontology. Critiques that focus on that will kind of more so, these are kind of more focused on identity politics that are more centered towards literally, the understanding of particular people's race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, etc. Right? Right. And then, like I said, the critique will always focus on something. Sometimes it's a critique of the affirmative. So maybe some evidence that you're specifically indicting, or the way that they're explaining or interpreting something. Critiques can also challenge performance in debate. So this can be, for example, some like the rhetoric that people choose to use in debate. It can be like any of those things, for example, like speed reading, right? Something like that. And then critiques of debate is about like challenging some of the normative focuses that we have, for example, like why we have speaker positions, why the time limits are as long or as short as they are, like why do we have time limits, why do we have a particular kind of composition of partnerships, and like why is it 2 instead of 3, right? Something like that, right? So critiques of debate will challenge literally the form of the activity, but not necessarily the content or like the particular round of like whatever they're reading for their affirmative case or something, right? And then lastly, answering critiques, right? So just like how some of the counterplan had an acronym, same thing for the critique. Postal is the acronym that you would want to remember, right, in order to make sure that you have a sufficient response to a critique, right? And you can obviously notice that pretty much almost all of it is the same as the counterplan, with only a few added additions. So the P is for permutation, because the alternative serves as a solvency advocate for the negative, just like the counterplan would. You can also make a permutation to that as well to ensure that the alternative, like we said, is mutually exclusive. It's its own thing. It's not just like stealing from the affirmative, right? So you can make a permutation. You can make an offensive argument. So you can challenge maybe, for example, like their theory of understanding is wrong. Maybe you can indict the author that they may have, and say why that author is bad. You can make an argument in terms of like why, whatever, the link question probably is like false, something like that, right? You can make a link term and say, why it's good, something like that, right? Solvency deficit, right? So you want to make an argument in terms of like why, right, in comparison, why the affirmative solves better than the alternative, right? Or probably resolve the biggest harms in comparison to the alternative, something like that, right? So you want to make a solvency deficit theory. This can be an argument, like I said, that can just be generally about the running critiques being bad. It can be about the type of critique that they read that was bad. It can be a theoretical argument about like them severing out of their representations, like reading argument about like capitalism, but they in the room with like a MacBook and like Starbucks and stuff, and like some, what I'm saying, like, I don't know, some Giuseppe's on or some Balenciagas, but then they just like capitalism is trash. Sounds conflicting. I don't know, right? You can make an argument there about theory, right? So some theoretical rejection of the critique, right? Alternative, this is kind of similar or consistent with the solvency deficit, where you want to make arguments where solvency deficit, you kind of make comparisons between the AFNA and the alternative. Alternative uniquely in this section can just be often specifically predicated toward the alternative and like what they do. Why maybe, for example, like if their alternative is just to reject the affirmative, why that's bad, right? Or if they shift to a different form of governance, for example, if you have a capitalist system and they want to shift to socialism or communism, you making arguments why like socialism or communism is bad. Like you can make those arguments essentially here, right? And then the link section, obviously you can make a defensive argument where you say that whatever explanation that they have just like doesn't apply to the affirmative, or how they are interpreting the affirmative is incorrect, right? So you can make a no link argument, or you can make a link turn, which would be you saying whatever they have problematized is actually good, right? And the affirmative promotes that. So if they're saying like capitalism is bad, a link term will be like capitalism is good. It's awesome, right? It makes us, you can get technological advances a lot easier. You know, life expectancy and different things like that is better in a world where we have like, you know, a capitalist system that can probably or give access to these things or whatever, right? So that's essentially what you want to do.